I drove 6 hours through the mountains to retrieve my late father's brass compass before the family cabin was supposedly condemned forever. Instead of finding a storm-damaged ruin, I unlocked the front door and stepped into polished hardwood floors, fresh furniture, warm lamps, neatly folded towels, and welcome baskets waiting for weekend guests. My brother had sworn the place wasn't safe to enter. Then I looked up at the new ceiling beams and recognized the lumber. I'd bought those exact materials months earlier, using my Coast Guard veteran discount. If you've ever trusted family enough to stop asking questions, stay with me. For several seconds, I simply stood inside the living room. The smell wasn't mold or soaked timber. It was fresh pine and furniture polish. Someone had even lit a cinnamon candle before leaving. The old stone fireplace had been cleaned. The cracked porch windows had been replaced. New quilts covered every bed. The cabin looked ready for vacation photos, not demolition. Caleb had called me 3 weeks earlier after the mountain storm. "It's worse than we thought," he said. "The county will probably condemn it. We should sell before it loses everything." I believed him. Not because the story made perfect sense. Because Caleb had cared for our father during the years I spent serving with the Coast Guard's search and rescue teams along the Atlantic coast. He had earned my trust long before he ever asked for it. I walked slowly toward the kitchen. Fresh coffee pods sat beside a rental-style instruction booklet. Emergency contact numbers were framed beside the refrigerator. A welcome sign read, "Enjoy your mountain escape." No family cabin waiting to be condemned looked like this. Years in search and rescue taught me to notice ordinary details before dramatic ones. People usually hid lies inside small, practical decisions. I crouched beside the fireplace. The new support beams had been fastened with galvanized brackets I immediately recognized. 2 months earlier, I purchased identical pressure-treated lumber from the county hardware supplier after Caleb asked whether he could use my veteran's discount for a few repair projects. I never asked which projects. I simply gave him the purchase authorization. Now those beams stretched across the cabin ceiling. Every measurement matched the order I remembered loading into his truck. I heard tires outside. Caleb stepped onto the porch carrying a toolbox. For one brief moment, surprise crossed his face. "Nathan, I wanted Dad's compass." He glanced around the room. "I can explain." "I hope so. The contractor got ahead of us." "What do you mean?" "I only approved emergency stabilization. He furnished the whole cabin without asking." "Interesting. Not I don't know who did this. Only the contractor went too far." Search and rescue work teaches another lesson. People protecting the truth usually describe what they know. People protecting themselves often describe what someone else supposedly did. I smiled and nodded, as though his explanation settled everything. "It happens." Relief immediately softened his shoulders. He believed I accepted the story. As Caleb walked toward the garage, I looked once more at the new support beams overhead. The lumber wasn't just familiar. The purchase numbers burned into the manufacturer labels matched the invoice I still kept inside my filing cabinet at home. Someone hadn't simply repaired the family cabin. They had quietly built an entirely different future inside it. The first thing I did was thank Caleb for driving all the way up the mountain. The second thing I did was tell him I still thought selling the cabin probably made sense. Neither statement was entirely dishonest. The cabin had become too much for one person to maintain. I simply wasn't convinced maintenance was the real conversation anymore. Coast Guard search and rescue taught me that people often reveal more after they believe the emergency has passed. Caleb relaxed almost immediately. I knew you'd understand. We both have our own lives. He smiled. Dad would have wanted us to move forward. Perhaps. Or perhaps Dad would have wanted us to begin by telling each other the truth. Instead of arguing, I helped Caleb carry several unopened storage boxes into the basement. Each one carried printed labels. Extra towels, kitchen supplies, guest bedding. Interesting. Not emergency repair materials, rental supplies. Caleb noticed me reading one label. The contractor ordered too much. I suppose that happens. Again, he looked relieved. That afternoon, I finally found my father's brass compass inside the old bedroom dresser. The leather case showed fresh dusting marks. Someone had recently handled it. Dad carried that compass every autumn hunting season. After he passed away, Caleb and I promised it would never leave the cabin unless both of us agreed. I slipped it carefully into my jacket pocket. Not because I planned to keep it. Because sometimes preserving evidence also means preserving memories. Before leaving the mountain, I drove past the county permit office. Retirement had taught me another lesson. Official records rarely share family loyalties. The clerk smiled politely. Can I help you? I'm checking permit history on an old family cabin. Within minutes, she printed the recent building permits. The first date caught my attention immediately. The structural repair permit had been approved 9 days before the storm, Caleb blamed for the damage. I quietly thanked her and folded the paperwork into my notebook. Preparation before destruction. That timeline made no sense. Unless the repairs had never actually been about storm recovery. On my drive home, I stopped at the county hardware supplier. The manager recognized me. Still putting that veteran's discount to good use? I hope so. He opened my purchase history. Pressure-treated beams, galvanized brackets, flooring, interior doors. The invoices carried my discount authorization. Every delivery had been signed for by Caleb. Nothing illegal. Everything properly documented. Only one detail refused to fit. The materials had been purchased nearly 3 weeks before anyone claimed the cabin was unsafe. That evening, Caleb called. Did you make it home? I did. Find Dad's compass? I found it. Good. He hesitated. So, are we still meeting with the trust attorney next month? I don't see any reason not to. His voice immediately sounded lighter. That's a relief. After we hung up, I spread the permits and purchase records across my dining room table. Storm damage, building permits, construction materials. None of their dates matched. One contradiction might have been a clerical mistake. 3 separate timelines pointing in the same impossible direction usually meant something else entirely. For the first time since opening the cabin door, I stopped wondering whether someone had repaired the property without permission. Started wondering why they needed me believing the repairs happened after the storm, when every official record quietly insisted they had begun long before the clouds ever arrived. The easiest thing I could have done was accuse Caleb that same afternoon. Instead, I called him and told him I thought he had probably been right all along. Maybe selling before the trust review is the smartest move. Silence filled the line for nearly 3 seconds. Then he laughed softly. I knew you'd come around. Coast Guard search and rescue taught me something I never forgot. People stop protecting a lie the moment they believe you've accepted it. From that day forward, I became the agreeable older brother. When Caleb suggested lowering the asking price, I agreed. When he talked about hiring a property manager before the sale, I nodded. When he said the cabin probably wasn't worth repairing any further, I smiled. Interesting, because someone had already repaired nearly everything. My surrender wasn't comfortable. Every agreement felt like another small betrayal of our father's memory. But every agreement also encouraged Caleb to stop watching me quite so carefully. 3 days later, I drove to see Laura Jenkins, a retired county building inspector who had signed off on hundreds of mountain cabins before retiring. She studied the permit copies without saying a word. Finally, she pointed to one approval stamp. "See this?" "What about it?" "The permit wasn't issued for emergency stabilization." "It wasn't?" "No." She slid another document across her desk. "This authorization allows interior renovation for residential occupancy." I looked at the paperwork again. So whoever filed this expected people to stay inside. Exactly. Long before anyone claimed the cabin was unsafe. Laura leaned back in her chair. "Storm repairs don't usually include guest accommodations." That one sentence quietly dismantled Caleb's explanation. Before leaving, I asked one final question. Could the county condemn a cabin after approving renovation permits? She smiled politely. They could, but not without new inspection reports. Were there any? Laura checked the records one more time. None. No condemnation report, no structural failure, no official safety order, only renovations. On my drive home, I stopped for coffee at a small gas station near the highway. While waiting in line, I noticed a tourism magazine advertising mountain weekend rentals. One photograph immediately caught my attention. The front porch looked familiar. Too familiar. I picked up the magazine. The listing included only a partial exterior photograph. No address, no owner. But the hand-built cedar railing matched the one my father and I installed nearly 20 years earlier. I quietly photographed the page before buying the magazine. That evening, I searched the property's online rental listing. After several attempts, I finally found it. The cabin wasn't advertised under our family name. It had been renamed Whisper Ridge Retreat. Professional photographs showed every room. Fresh furniture, the new fireplace, the support beams. Even my father's handcrafted rocking chair sat beside the window, exactly where he always left it. Future weekends already displayed reservation dates. The cabin hadn't been repaired to prepare for a sale. It had been repaired to generate income. For several long minutes, I simply stared at the booking calendar. The investigation had just changed direction. The real question was no longer whether Caleb had hidden the renovations. It was who expected to profit from a cabin the family trust still believed had been condemned beyond repair. The booking calendar changed everything. Until that moment, I believed Caleb wanted me to stay away from the cabin. Now I understood he wanted something far more valuable. He wanted time. Every confirmed reservation meant another payment. Every passing weekend quietly increased the property's value before the family trust review. Coast Guard search and rescue taught me that rescuers often waste precious hours looking where the emergency first appears. Experienced crews learn to ask a different question. What is everyone else trying not to notice? The following morning, I drove to the small property management office listed on the Whisper Ridge Retreat website. I introduced myself only as a family member, reviewing cabin records before an estate meeting. The office manager smiled politely. We've had wonderful guests there. Busy season? Almost every weekend. She opened the reservation calendar. The cabin had accepted bookings for nearly 4 months. 4 months. Long before Caleb told me the property had become unsafe. I thanked her and asked one more question. Who handles maintenance approvals? She checked the management agreement. The owner representative. Who is that? Caleb Cole. No contractor, no temporary caretaker, only my brother. Outside the office, I sat in my truck for several minutes without starting the engine. The contractor story had quietly disappeared on its own. That afternoon, I visited the insurance agency that had covered the cabin for decades. The representative remembered my father immediately. How can I help? I'm reviewing old property paperwork. Within minutes, she located the file. There was a storm claim. I know. She frowned. Actually, what? It was opened, then canceled. No payment? None. I looked at the cancellation date. It came 3 days after the structural renovation permit had already been approved. Interesting. If the repairs had truly resulted from storm damage, why cancel the insurance claim after construction had already begun? The timeline refused to cooperate with Caleb's explanation. Late that afternoon, I met Laura again. She spread every document across a long conference table. Permit approvals, construction invoices, insurance records, rental agreements. None of them matched the story my brother had given me. Then Laura pointed to something I had overlooked. Look at the mailing address. What about it? The trust correspondence. Every permit notification had been copied to the attorney overseeing our family trust. So the attorney knew repairs were happening? Yes, but probably not why. That single observation changed the entire investigation. The trust review wasn't simply another family meeting. It was the deadline every document seemed to anticipate. That evening, Caleb called. The attorney confirmed next week's trust review. I'll be there. I think selling the cabin will make everything easier. Interesting. Again, he never mentioned the rentals, never mentioned guests, never mentioned the renovation. Only the sale. After we ended the call, I opened the online reservation calendar once more. Nearly every upcoming weekend had already been booked. Someone expected the cabin to remain in operation long after the trust review concluded. For the first time since unlocking that front door, I stopped asking who repaired the cabin. The real question had become much more difficult. What financial problem was serious enough that Caleb believed secretly transforming our father's cabin into a profitable business was the only way to survive the trust review without telling me the truth? 5 days remained before the family trust review. By then, every document seemed to point toward the same conclusion. The cabin had never been prepared for demolition. It had been prepared to become a business. What still escaped me was why Caleb believed he had to hide it. During my years in Coast Guard search and rescue, I learned that rescuing someone rarely began with finding them. It began with understanding why they disappeared. The following morning, Laura called. "I think I found what you've been missing." "What is it?" "The financing records." An hour later, we met at the county recorder's office. Laura handed me a certified property filing. It wasn't a mortgage against the cabin. It was a lien against Caleb's construction company. The filing amount was larger than I expected, large enough to threaten the business completely. "What happened?" She quietly shrugged. "Several commercial projects failed." I looked farther down the page. Collection deadlines, legal notices, payment demands. Every document had arrived within the same month the cabin renovations began. Suddenly, the timing made perfect sense. Caleb hadn't started repairing the cabin because the storm forced him to. He started because his business was already sinking. That afternoon, I drove past the construction yard where Caleb had worked for nearly 30 years. Half the equipment was gone. Several storage buildings stood empty. A faded sign on the gate announced, "Equipment auction completed." I sat there for several minutes. Our father had built that company one pickup truck at a time. Watching it disappear hurt almost as much as losing him. That evening, my niece Hannah stopped by unexpectedly. She had no idea I had been investigating her father. "Uncle Nate, it's good to see you." She smiled nervously. "Dad's been working nonstop." "I know. I think he's worried." "Worried about what?" She hesitated. "The business. Not the cabin. Not the trust. The business. He says if he can just make it through one more season, everything will be okay." There was no deception in her voice. Only hope. I suddenly understood who Caleb had been trying hardest to protect. Not himself. His daughter. After Hannah left, I opened the trust documents Dad had prepared years earlier. One paragraph immediately caught my attention. The cabin could not be transferred, sold, or commercially operated without written approval from every surviving beneficiary. Neither Caleb nor I had ever signed such approval. The rental business violated the trust before the first guest ever checked in. Just before sunset, Laura called again. I checked one final record. "What did you find?" "The canceled insurance claim." "Yes." "It wasn't canceled because repairs were finished." "Then why?" She paused. "Because accepting insurance money that would have required notifying the trust administrator about the property's true condition." I slowly closed the trust folder. There it was. The missing piece. The insurance claim wasn't abandoned to save paperwork. It was abandoned to keep the trust from discovering the renovations before the review. For the first time since unlocking the cabin door, I stopped seeing Caleb as a brother stealing family property. I saw a frightened father trying to outrun financial collapse with the only asset he believed could still save his daughter. The tragedy wasn't that he loved his family too little. It was that fear had finally convinced him to love the truth too little. 3 days remained before the family trust review. By then, I knew exactly why Caleb had hidden the cabin. What I still didn't know was whether he intended to tell the truth before someone else forced it into the open. That distinction mattered. During my years in the Coast Guard, every rescue mission eventually reached a point where the people involved had one final opportunity to help save themselves. The following morning, Laura Jenkins arrived carrying a thick folder. I finished organizing everything. Inside were every document we had collected during the past 2 weeks. The building permits, the contractor invoices, my veteran's discount purchase history, the canceled insurance claim, the rental management agreement, the trust provisions, and finally, the county lien records against Caleb's construction company. No missing pages, no assumptions. Only chronology, track A had finally become track B. The cabin renovations no longer looked like an isolated family decision. They formed one continuous financial timeline. Laura placed the papers in order across my dining room table. When someone reads these from beginning to end, they'll see the entire story. She nodded, without anyone needing to accuse anybody. That was exactly what I wanted. Evidence should never require anger to become convincing. Late that afternoon, I drove back to the mountain. The cabin sat quietly beneath tall pines. A young family loaded suitcases into their car after what had clearly been a weekend vacation. The children waved as they drove away. One little boy shouted, "We'll come back next summer." I smiled and waved. None of them knew they had unknowingly become part of a family secret. Inside the cabin, everything remained spotless. Guest logbooks rested beside the fireplace. I opened the most recent one. Every visitor praised the peaceful setting, the beautiful restoration, the craftsmanship. One comment stayed with me. It feels like someone loved this place long before we arrived. My father would have appreciated that. So would Caleb. The tragedy wasn't the restoration. It was the silence surrounding it. As I prepared to leave, Caleb's truck pulled into the driveway. He looked surprised. "I didn't know you were coming up. I wanted one last visit before the trust meeting." He nodded. "We've both been thinking a lot." "Yes." He looked around the cabin. "I know it isn't perfect. No place ever is." For several moments, neither of us spoke. Then he quietly asked, "If things had gone differently?" I waited. "Do you think Dad would have understood?" There it was. Not denial. Not another explanation. Only guilt searching for permission. I think Dad always understood why people became afraid. And he never believed fear made dishonesty necessary. Caleb lowered his eyes. He didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. He simply stood there looking older than I had ever seen him. As I drove home that evening, I realized he had just received the final chance my conscience required me to give him. If he chose honesty before the trust review, our family might still heal. If he chose silence, the documents would have to speak for both of us. That night, Laura called one final time. The trust attorney confirmed tomorrow's agenda. And the cabin is the first item. I closed the evidence folder and placed my father's brass compass on top of it. Tomorrow would not be about winning an argument. It would be about deciding whether our father's legacy would continue resting on quiet trust or finally return to the truth he spent his entire life teaching us to protect. The family trust review began at 10 o'clock on a quiet Thursday morning. The conference room overlooked the valley where my father had built his construction business, one pickup truck and one customer at a time. Around the table sat the trust attorney, our accountant, Laura Jenkins, Caleb, and me. My father's brass compass rested inside my jacket pocket. I carried it for one reason, not as evidence. As a reminder. Whenever he faced a difficult decision, Dad would quietly place that compass on the table and say, "If you lose your direction, don't blame the road." Today, I intended to remember that. The attorney opened the meeting with ordinary business. Investment statements, tax filings, maintenance expenses. Then he reached the final agenda item. The mountain cabin. Caleb spoke first. "I still believe selling is the responsible choice." The attorney nodded. "Can you explain why?" "It suffered serious storm damage." I remained silent. He continued. "The repairs would cost more than the property is worth." Laura quietly looked toward me. "Not yet." The attorney asked another question. "Has anyone obtained updated inspection reports?" Caleb hesitated. "I don't believe they're necessary." Laura slowly placed one document onto the conference table. The structural occupancy permit. Approved weeks before the storm. The attorney frowned. "This indicates renovation rather than condemnation." Caleb looked down. No one spoke. Laura added the contractor invoices, then the county building permits, then my veterans discount purchase records. Each document fit the previous one. No explanations required. The attorney quietly continued reading. "These materials were purchased under Nathan Cole's account." "Yes, but signed for by Caleb Cole." Caleb closed his eyes briefly. "I was going to explain." The attorney calmly replied, "Please do." For the first time since I found the cabin fully furnished, my brother stopped protecting the story. My business was failing. No one interrupted. I thought if I restored the cabin and rented it for a year, he swallowed hard, I could recover without anyone losing anything. Laura quietly placed the rental management agreement beside the permits. The attorney compared both dates. The rentals had begun months before the trust review. Then came the canceled insurance claim. Finally, the trust document requiring unanimous written approval before any commercial operation of the cabin. No such approval existed. The attorney closed the folder. "The evidence establishes that the property was intentionally renovated, commercially operated, and withheld from full trust disclosure." No anger, no accusations, only chronology. Exactly as I had hoped. Caleb slowly looked toward me. "I never wanted to steal the cabin. I know. I only wanted time. I know. I kept thinking one more season would fix everything." I reached into my jacket and placed Dad's brass compass on the table. "It never works that way." The room remained completely silent. The attorney reviewed one final recommendation. The rental operation would immediately stop. Future income would be placed into the family trust. The commercial activity would be fully disclosed. The cabin would remain jointly owned. Caleb's construction debt would be addressed separately through lawful restructuring rather than hidden family assets. Laura quietly smiled. Not because anyone had won, because the truth finally no longer needed protecting. As the meeting ended, Caleb stopped beside the conference room door. "I thought telling you the truth would cost me my family." I looked at my father's compass one last time. The lie almost did. Walking toward the parking lot, I realized the cabin had never been the real inheritance. The real inheritance had always been whether two brothers could still find their way back to honesty before fear permanently replaced the direction their father spent a lifetime teaching them to follow. 3 months after the trust review, the mountain cabin still belonged to our family. So did the truth. That mattered more than either Caleb or I had understood when everything began. The trust agreement was formally updated. Future rental income would remain completely transparent, with every dollar reported to all beneficiaries before a single reservation was accepted. A small management committee, including both of us and the trust attorney, approved every major decision involving the property. No more hidden renovations, no more private business plans, no more silent assumptions, only honest stewardship. Caleb's construction company never fully recovered, but through a court-approved repayment plan, he slowly rebuilt what remained instead of risking the family's inheritance again. It took years rather than months, yet every payment represented something far more valuable than money. It represented trust, returning one careful decision at a time. One autumn afternoon, Hannah invited both of us back to the cabin. She had arranged the living room exactly the way our father always kept it. The old rocking chair faced the stone fireplace. The brass compass rested on the mantel. Fresh coffee filled the room with the same familiar scent Dad loved every hunting season. Hannah smiled. "I thought this place should feel like home again." Neither Caleb nor I answered immediately. There wasn't much left to say. Before leaving, I walked onto the porch overlooking the valley. The cedar railing my father and I built decades earlier still stood exactly where it always had. Strong, weathered, reliable. Very much like the man who taught us that real inheritance was never measured in land or buildings. It was measured in the honesty required to care for them. A small wooden plaque now hangs beside the front door. It doesn't mention our family name. It simply reads, "Leave this place better than you found it." Every guest who visits the cabin reads those words before stepping inside. Most probably think they describe housekeeping. Our family knows they describe something much larger. If this story reminded you that fear often begins with one small secret, while healing begins with one honest conversation, carry that lesson into your own family. Protect relationships before possessions. Choose truth before convenience. And remember that the greatest inheritance we leave behind is the integrity others can still trust long after we are gone. God bless every veteran, every family, every quiet guardian of a shared legacy, and every person who chooses honesty even when it costs far more than silence.